Welcome to our very first CTS weekly meeting. We're trying to connect all of our colleagues together so that we can share information and help keep folks out of crisis. Unfortunately, the CTS annual meeting usually is in January, and due to our anticipated and now evident current surge, it was the leadership made the decision to cancel the meeting this month, but replace it with what we're doing right now. So I thank you all for being here. The idea for this just started a couple weeks ago, and because we lost revenue from the meeting, a lot of people though are supportive of our effort to keep connected, and we recognize Fisher Paykel and Electromed for helping support this meeting so that we can pay for the platform to connect. The purpose of this meeting is so that I know everybody's heard the term crisis care. I first should introduce myself. I'm Asha Devereaux, a past president of CTS, and I was involved in the graphic you see to the right from the National Academy of Medicine's Crisis Standards of Care meeting, along with my colleagues, Christian Sandrock and Denny Amundson. We have been thinking about mass critical care during pandemics and disasters, probably now almost 20 years. And unfortunately, that day has arrived here. So part of the dynamics is that we need to share information. And as we started hearing about ventilator shortages and the SNS vents being deployed, oxygen situations, we thought, let's bring in Rich and some experts who have used some of the devices that have been deployed. And then this is your forum and have an opportunity to ask questions. And then an open forum where if folks have identified other things that people aren't thinking about, let's bring it out and see what we can do to bring expertise in or group think some solutions. So with that, just a quick informational slide on what we've got going right now. And this is all on websites for the state of California. There are some things that are called alternate care sites. I am a member of the California, the CalMat teams, where most of our CalMat folks are deployed to these sites ranging throughout the state of California, and they are taking care of overflow COVID patients who are hypoxemic on various levels of oxygen. They are infusing remdesivir and administering steroids and managing these folks in alternate care settings. And at any point, you can take a look at what the bed status is and that there is still some capacity there. And so just know that this is going on outside of your ICUs. But in order to help decrease the surge in the ICUs. This is just a slide from the LA County website showing what's going on right now. As of a few hours ago, there are total available beds is 761, but if you look at this data, most are pediatric and only a few hundred adult beds are available. But the concerning thing was right here. Only 54 ICU beds are currently available in the city. As for supplies, we always think about staff, stuff, and supplies to when we're organizing ourselves for surge and disaster preparedness. And these are some dashboards that they've been keeping an eye on. And the focus of today is this aspect here regarding the ventilators. And they're they've deployed nearly 274 vents, and some have been returned. And that was because of maybe functionality issues or utility issues. So I invite Rich Branson and Rob Chatburn to discuss some of their expertise with the SNS vents and oxygen systems.
So again, we have a very short period of time, so I'll try to do this quickly. Asha and I have been on a task force that's ACCP, ATS, SCCM, AARC, multiple other societies, sponsored and wrote some of the first papers about the expectation of this problem. And I keep telling people, in 2013, we sat in a room in Salt Lake City for a couple of days, and not me, because it's not my thing. I asked the question, what's the worst thing that would happen? And somebody said, we could have SARS, only it would be easy to catch. And here we are. So with respect to ventilators, this was in the public news, talking about ventilators that the government had decided they were going to purchase early on. So there were lots of them. We published a paper in CHEST that includes a number of people, including Asha, looking at ventilator acquisitions and looking at the numbers here and the amount of money that was spent. So, and I'll give you a little bit more granularity in a minute, but this is some of it kind of distracting. There are 50,000 Aeron Newton ventilators, which are all pneumatic, in the stockpile, and their statement for intended use says not for use in critical care. So I'm not sure who made that decision, but there are some devices, I think, obviously, that will work very well, and some that will be less capable. So again, this, what I said before, following the last group of outbreaks, somebody asked about what would the problem be, and so we decided that if patients are going to get bad ARDS, and there were lots of them, they would have to be able to perform according to the ARDSNet ARMA trial. So here's some of that data, and some of the data from the MGH COVID report from the Blue Journal, which was their first 68 or 69 patients, I believe. So I think I'd be interested to hear what your guys' experience is in California, but the PEEP is about the same as the first day in ARDSNet ARMA. Remember, that's the low PEEP, high FiO2 table, but the FiO2s are significantly higher, and minute ventilations are a little bit less, and maybe the peak pressures are lower, although these are plateau pressures. This wasn't in the initial report, but Taylor Thompson was nice enough to send me the data. So people always say, well, I don't think that ventilator can meet the needs of my COVID patients. Well, this is how that was decided. Well, if your ventilator can perform this, has alarms and monitoring, then we probably should agree that it's capable of ventilating those patients. So this is a figure from the paper that we published. And there are clearly ventilators that we would consider to be full function, means volume control, pressure control. They can do airway pressure, volume, and flow waveforms. They are capable of alarms and monitoring, analogous to critical care. Now, some of this is pretty simple because the GE CareScape, the Hamilton C1 and C3 are ICU ventilators. Unfortunately, I don't know how many of those we have, but it's a smaller number than some of the other devices. The Vyaire LTV2, which some people have gotten, I know a lot of them have gone overseas. The only limitation here is lack of a waveform screen. I know you guys got a bunch of Ventec V+ Pros, and the Philips Evo 300 also has these capabilities. But on this side, you know, some of these ventilators were essentially made for non-invasive ventilation. The formerly Puritan Med, now Medtronic 560, the Astral, the Philips Evo, being different than the EV300, doesn't have a blender and has other limitations, and the 2150 as well. The Zoll 731 is a portable ventilator the military uses and is very capable, but doesn't have the displays of pressure, volume, and flow, and performance-wise isn't comparable necessarily to these in terms of delivery of gas and triggering spontaneous breathing. And then, you know, the Hillrom device is the old breathe device. It was meant to clip on your belt and help a patient who's with COPD who's ambulating not get short of breath. I have no idea why they bought those. And then the 50,000, this says Neutron, it's Newton, P-N-E-U-T-O-N, is like the old Urgency Bird, for some of you who remember it. It's a totally pneumatic ventilator, It can only provide 65% or 100% oxygen. It can only provide volume control, and the mandatory breaths during volume control are limited to a peak flow of 36 liters a minute. And it's always in SIMV. And germane to this discussion later, the Newton uses a lot of gas because it's a pneumatic device. And the Save 2 is a device that the military built for I guess, battlefield mechanical ventilation, although, and some of you probably are obviously ex-military, we don't ventilate very many people on the battlefield. Usually just try to get them back someplace in a hurry. So there's quite a range of capabilities among the ventilators that were purchased. And unfortunately, some of the ones we have a lot of probably wouldn't be all that helpful in our current problem. So I know you guys got some B+ pros from Ventec. So I asked the guys from Ventec, you know, and Asha, maybe you can jump in. What I was told was they're using the V+ pros to do high flow nasal cannula, but they're not really using it as a ventilator, or they prefer to use the LTV. Is that
right?
Okay. And do you know what the reason for that is?
No, I don't. And that's why I'd asked Vinod to step in. But if anybody in the in our audience has received these vents and had some concerns with them, please share your knowledge.
I'll just run through this. So I asked the Voxen, the Ventec guys again. Ventec makes the Voxen ventilator, which is more than a ventilator. It's a ventilator with an oxygen concentrator built in, a cough assist device, a suction machine, and a nebulizer. But the V+ Pro and the V+ that's an emergency vent are just ventilators. They don't have the oxygen concentrator in them, which makes them simpler. So I asked the guys, Samir Ahmad, who I think Samir might be on, put these figures together. So this is, you know, the device was intended to be able to do high flow nasal oxygen if you wanted to, and just shows the screens. You pick the ventilation settings and select high flow is on, and you select oxygen settings and set the FiO2. What's important is this, and I'm going to show you two more slides and then I'm going to stop, is that for high flow nasal cannula, you need this valveless heated circuit. And my perception from a couple people I talked to were they'd never seen the ventilator before, and the different circuits were confusing. So it's really simple to set it up once you've been shown how to do high flow nasal oxygen. But when you switch to doing, because the device, you know, very similar to modern devices used in this area, can also do non-invasive ventilation with a face mask and has the ability to compensate for leaks. And so in this case, you go to ventilation settings and you're going to do bi-level as the mode, and then you can set the IPAP and the EPAP, the flow trigger, the rise time, the maximum inspiratory time, and a backup rate if you want to. And again, the oxygen settings are set the same way. It's just now the circuit is different. So now you move to a circuit that is inactive, and active meaning there's an exhalation valve in it, so that connects to the face mask. There's a single tube that goes back from the circuit. These two ports are to the pneumatac at the airway, and this port is for airway pressure and the exhalation, for the exhalation valve, and the filter goes on here to prevent contamination of the room. And then finally, if you want to use it in an intubated patient, similar look at the circuit, an active heated circuit connected to an endotracheal tube. Not that it necessarily matters, but for those people who are saying, I'd rather have the LTV because you're comfortable with it, I understand that. But if the concern is performance, the same engineer who developed the LTV developed the Voxen and the Ventec V+ Pros. So from a performance standpoint, they're very comparable. In fact, the Voxen or Ventec devices, the V+ Pro, is much more capable in non-invasive ventilation. And of course, the LTV can't do high flow nasal oxygen. The PEEP goes up to 20, and we haven't seen a lot of high PEEPs. Again, maybe you can tell me again that in California you're seeing higher PEEPs, but from my standpoint, there's nothing about this device, or for that matter, the Evo 300, or for that matter, some of the other devices that I just showed you, the Hamilton T1, which is a portable ventilator, that would not allow them to meet the demands of these patients.
Yeah, this is Samir Ahmad from Ventec. My background was in Philips, developed the V60, was involved also in the trilogy on the non-invasive ward, and also with the breathe technologies. And now I've been with Ventec for a few years. This is a very capable ventilator, not because, I'm one of the designers, but no, it does high flow, same as the FMP, high flow device, same ranges, same monitoring. It does non-invasive as good and better than the V60 and Trilogy, and it does very good invasive also, similar to the LTV and other ICU ventilators.
Okay, are there any respiratory therapists or physicians from the California group that said, we had this ventilator and I couldn't figure out how to use it, or I used it and it didn't work right? Or I have to tell you again, the New York experience so long ago now, they got the LTVs and uniformly we heard, it won't work. Well, why won't it work? Well, there's no waveforms. I can't see what's going on. And again, that to me, that actually is important information, because it means the standard expectation of therapists and physicians at the bedside are to see pressure, volume, and flow to help them titrate mechanical ventilation. But that's different than the device won't ventilate my patients. So I think we learned a lot about, trying to educate people. And it's, I'm no different. When you first bring a ventilator to the bedside and you've never used it before, just trying to figure out how to turn it on sometimes can be complicated. Asha, I don't know, again, we just had very brief chat, and I wanted to give you a very high level view in such a short meeting.
Hi, I'm the respiratory care educator at Loma Linda University Medical Center in California. And we received the Voxen ventilators as our emergency ventilators. So I was able to figure it out pretty easily, did a quick one-page tip sheet for my therapist, sent it out, did like a quick 5-minute in-service on it. And we've been using it. Now I can tell you, we haven't used it on our COVID patients just because of the graphics. The therapists do like to see those graphics. However, we are using it on our cardiothoracic patients that we're doing cardiac surgery on, MVRs, AVRs, and we're using that in place and pulling out our more critical ventilators for those critical patients. We haven't had an issue with it. The only issue we had is the circuits were backordered. So we only received 12 of the circuits.
And this is Chris Brooks from Ventec. Thank you for providing that. We have circuits available, so that back order should not be an issue. And if you haven't received the complete shipment, just let us know. And I put it in the chat as well. We've got a ton of on-demand training available, videos and guides, as well as we're happy to set up at a time convenient for you or your team a clinical training via Zoom with our team on demand. So definitely understand that these are new to some of you, but as Rich mentioned, from a functional standpoint, they should work very similar, if not better, than a lot of the other devices for both ventilation and high flow. And more than happy to give you the training that you need to feel comfortable.
So yeah, I had talked to Chris a couple of times after Asha had first called me, and again, I can't speak for the company, but they're very willing to do online training with your staff at your convenience. If that means 8 o'clock at night, they'll do it 8 o'clock at night. And again, there are some trainings that are online, but they're willing to do live trainings, especially if you're in trouble and you have patients that need to go on. And one thing that I thought I heard was about the graphics, and the Voxen has airway pressure, volume, and flow graphics. So if you're worried about not using them because you don't have it, it's a matter of trying to make sure everybody knows how to access those displays, because it measures pressure, volume, and flow at the airway with that pneumatic, and gets you inspiratory and expiratory flow, inspiratory and expiratory volumes, as well as airway pressures. Rob Chapman is a friend of mine. We've known each other 30 plus years. We wrote a book together. He's a respiratory therapist, and he's at the Cleveland Clinic, where he's also professor of medicine at Case Western. And he has spent a lot of time trying to understand this oxygen issue. So Rob, I'm gonna try to let you share your screen. Can you do that?
Okay, I'm ready to roll here. Hang on.
Okay. I see you. Hey, nice room.
I live in a medieval castle these days. I moved to Germany. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to rush into it because there's very little I can convey in 5 minutes. But what I've learned about this is that you have to take a top-down approach, meaning you have to start at your source of medical gas, either whether air or oxygen, and you have to work with your facilities engineers. You have to get them to help you with blueprints and piping schematics for probably any place that you're going to be using oxygen in high demand, whether it's an ICU or floor division. You have to get them to help you to read them. And you have to have a two-way communication, because I found that they uniformly have a very a limited understanding of the end user issues. And by end user, I mean us sticking things in the wall and expecting gas to come out. And so their expectations in terms of risk and capacity are usually greatly misunderstood. So you have to get with these people, understand their issues, communicate with them, look at the blueprints, and you're going to find something sort of like this. This is just a very simplified schematic of what happens. You have a source gas, and the choke point there is what are called risers. Usually these are pipes that go from floor to floor. These risers then spread out, and they supply zone valves. These are where your shutoff valves are, usually in the ICUs on the patient divisions. These are alarmed, and if the alarms, the supply pressure drops usually below 50 PSI, alarm will go off. These zone valves represent a choke point because they can only handle so much flow before the alarm goes off. And finally, they spread out in outlet pipes going to individual rooms and individual medical devices. So each one of these areas represents a choke point that must be evaluated to determine what the actual capacity is. So for example, if you're talking about tanks, if you're talking about banks of compressed gas, then your choke point or your concern or your risk is insufficient supply. Whereas if you're talking about liquid oxygen in this case, and by the way, air is usually not the problem. Air is usually not the limiting factor. It's mostly oxygen in my experience. And so there are three things to be concerned here with insufficient supply, which should not be a problem. If you know what your usage is, you're going to have tanker cars coming up and supplying these all the time. More of a problem might be icing. As you can see here, this is from our own institution. And just over the course of the year, you can see that the icing has gotten much worse as the peak demand has gone up. And we have decided to act and to de-ice these heat exchangers if they reach 50%. And here you can see one is already at 30%. Now, when you talk to your facilities engineers, they're going to be able to give you the specs on the diameters of the piping systems. And that diameter determines the maximum capacity, in this case, with a pressure drop of 1 PSI. So you want to know what that is. Of course, pressure drop is flow dependent. So then once you get past the risers, you get down to the individual zone valves. And again, this is just a little clip out of what a blueprint might look like. And these are alarmed, as I said, for air and oxygen. And if you draw too much flow from them, the pressure drop will cause an alarm. And you need to know what size the pipe fitting is so that you can know what the capacity is, the maximum capacity at an assumed pressure drop. In this case, we assumed 1 PSI. And then what do? Well, you got to have a spreadsheet and the calculations. And what I did was I just assumed the worst case scenario, which would be high flow nasal cannula at every bedside. Nasal cannulas at high flow are run anywhere from 15 to 60 liters a minute. So the worst case scenario would be every outlet with oxygen is running at 60 liters a minute. So you go out and you map out the risers in the division and the ICUs and how many beds they are, and you crank in a worst case scenario and you figure out what is the maximum capacity that the riser can handle. And if that's good, then you go down to the zone valve, carry these calculations through. And in this case, we could get 70 beds from the zone valve, even at 60 liters per minute. And if that checks out, then you want to go down and find out at the outlet in the ICU room, what is the maximum number of beds that you can support relative to the number of beds that are actually there? What is the expected pressure drop at the maximum gas usage? And these are some actual calculations that I did it in our ICUs. And as you can see, it appears that we're going to be okay. So how do you make these calculations? Well, first of all, if you find that you have a pressure drop problem here, or you have a flow capacity limitation, and you can't handle 60 liters a minute at the bedside, that's the worst case. Well, then you're gonna have to scale back. Now the question is, scale back to what? So now you're gonna have to ask the question of what are the different combinations of things that you're gonna attach to the wall. In this case, this is a calculation where you're just looking at ventilator usage. And of course, the ventilator oxygen consumption will be dependent on how many ventilators and how long they're gonna be used, and what the minute ventilation is, what the FiO2 is. All these things come into play. And you can use this kind of a spreadsheet for other devices like high flow nasal cannulas as well. And as a result of these calculations, you'll get oxygen consumption rate. And in this case, the spreadsheet is set up so you have a low estimate and a high estimate, because all of this is guessing. You can calculate it in terms of liters or cubic feet. Cubic feet per minute are used, or per unit of time are used by engineers. They're more familiar with that. So you can do this for compressed gas here with tanks if you have to run an emergency ICU out in the field somewhere, or if you're just talking about liquid oxygen, you can do that as well. Now there's another calculator that's available, and I'll give you references to all this stuff. And by the way, Rich has my slides. He's more than welcome to share them with you, but I'll give you a link to that as well. There's another calculator out there that'll help you. It's a little prettier to use, easier to use, because it's not a spreadsheet that runs in Excel, but it's basically a 3-step process to determine these things like oxygen consumption per day, tanks per day if you're on tanks, total supply, and how long the supply will last. So I think that's very useful. The downside of this calculator, though, is they don't share with you the equations on the back end. So there's no way to verify details like, are they talking about BTPS or STPD, which turn out to be significant in high flow rates. So there's something to be considered. So the take-home message, I want to wrap up very quickly. Medical gas supply is limited by volume capacity, by flow capacity, by heat transfer capacity, meaning icing. And all these limitations ultimately determine how many medical devices you can stick on outlets in ICUs. Patient care zone valves seem to be the most common choke point. At least that was true in my analysis at the Cleveland Clinic. You must consult blueprints and consult with your facilities engineers to understand these issues and get a good relationship going with these people. Explain to them what your expectations are. There are calculators available to do all the things I just mentioned, and I'll give you a link to that. And in fact, these are the links. And also the AARC has some guidance that Rich and I put together, another source of at least one of these calculators. So you can take a screenshot of this and go to these websites. These are just basically OneDrive shared folders that have calculators, and the calculators run in Excel. So needless to say, this is a heavy topic. I spent many, many hours trying to understand it. And again, the essential ingredient here is that you communicate with your facilities engineers, because they don't understand any of this. So with that, I'll conclude and take any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Rob. This was excellent. There are hospital systems in Los Angeles, the smaller ones, that had to surge where they were seeing the freezing issues. And oxygen has been set up at various parts of our state in case of that freezing that you showed us pictures of. So thank you very much.
Rob and I had an interesting exchange the other day where, you know, he spent hours trying to figure this out, and then it comes down to is really a very practical, well, what are we going to do about it? And what are some of the just everyday ideas? So one of the things that's come up multiple times, I know that I think Rob was the first to discover, is we heard all about people increasing their ICU capacity. Well, they increased their ICU capacity on a general ward floor. Well, the pipes on the general ward floor, you know, when they laid out the hospital, they didn't put the 3-inch diameter pipes for oxygen to the, you know, to the ward that usually has the post-delivery moms, because they hardly ever give any oxygen. So if you try to put ventilators and high flow nasal cannula systems in those wards, they fail because the piping just can't meet the demand. I mean, that's just a very practical way of looking at it. And I think about ventilators that we talked about. I'm going to assume you guys have got a number of LTV 1200s. If you do have a number of LTV 1200s, make sure you turn the bias flow off. Otherwise, it's 10 liters a minute during the expiratory flow. And think about that with all your ventilators that have a expiratory bias flow. Now, some of it might impact the triggering a little bit, usually negligibly, but that's one way to save oxygen. Again, Rob mentioned, it's interesting, I can't tell you how many people I have told high flow nasal cannula uses far more oxygen than the ventilator does. And it's the difference between the minute volume and the flow for high flow nasal cannula. So use the lowest high flow nasal cannula flow that will work, the flow rate that will work. And you can actually augment that by using the high flow nasal cannula and then just put a simple mask over the patient's face to act more as a reservoir to increase the FiO2 that they get and maybe decrease the flow. I know that's heresy for people who are high flow nasal cannula aficionados, but there are some simple, very practical things that we could do. Of course, the simplest things are things like don't leave the flow meters on to the manual resuscitators in the ICU. I know it's convenient and it's always bad form if you start bagging somebody who's on 100% oxygen with room air, but there are devices that allow that to happen. I think you really have to think very pragmatically at the bedside about ways that you can decrease the oxygen that you're using.
Thank you, Rich. That's very, very insightful because many people are kind of MacGyvering their way through all of this. I think if there's a couple, Vinod, yeah, if you're on, if you can share some of your insights.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. I just want to share some of our experience with Voxen. But before that, as Rich was sharing about conserving oxygen, what we did at Emory is we were using Oxymizer as a conserving device. So a lot of our patients on floors were on 10 liters, 12 liters oxygen because we were running out of ICU beds too. So that's one of the things we've done here at Emory Midtown, just to keep our patients on the floor. So they, because we didn't have any ICU beds. So I just want to share that too. If you have oxymizers, that could work too.
I guess if everybody doesn't know, the oxymizer is a cannula that some people call the mustache cannula, and it's big and it actually has a reservoir built in. So it was used in home care to try and reduce the amount of oxygen you had to replace all the time. I have to, and then there's the old pendant one too, but I have to tell you, I don't think. But did you have some of those? Did you order them? I don't think there's I bet there's not a single one in our whole hospital.
Yeah, I think we probably just ran out of it recently. So we were using it until now. So again, with Voxen, so we purchased about 10 Voxen in January, and the clinical team was amazing. They came and did in-services. They were here. They were with us for about 36 hours straight. So our staff were pretty confident using it. And what we did is made it more meaningful for our staff to use it on our patients. So during the surge, initial surge, we ran out of all our ICU ventilators. So we had to come up with a creative idea on what we could do better. So what we did at Emory Midtown was we put a lot of our V60 BiPAPs on trach patients. So on our neuro ICU, we had like a lot of our patients on V60 with pressure control. And in our medical ICU, once the patients were a little stable, we switched patients to the Voxen ventilator because we could not, we really didn't have enough ICU vents. So what we did is we created a quick criteria on patients 50% or less, PEEP of 12 or less, minute ventilation, 12 liters or less, we would switch them to Voxen. So that really worked, worked really well for us. And what our staff loved about it is the versatility on, it's small and it's easy to use. And they're able to clear secretions with cough therapy. So a lot of these patients are having lots of secretions and we didn't have to disconnect. We can just use cough therapy instead of suctioning patients. What else? And also like later on, once the patients got trach, we were able to use that as a high flow system. So couple of the challenges our staff were facing was with circuits, because Voxen had multiple circuits. So at Emory Midtown, we decided that we would just use one type of Voxen circuit, that is just the active heated circuit with oxygen. And for non-invasive, or with the high flow system, we will use our current high flow circuit. So it'll make it so much easier for our staff, and actually it worked really well. So we would use, when the patient's on a ventilator, we would just use a Voxen circuit. And if they go on high flow, we just swap the circuit out. And, we were trying to, do that, and that really worked really well. And some of the other challenges we had was with the filter. Initially, like the Voxen did not have a filtration device, so they created the boot so we can attach the filter. That really, that really helped us a lot. What else? And some of the challenges I'm facing right now is because a lot of our staff are leaving for travel assignments, and I have about 18 travelers. So it's really hard to keep the competency on our new staff, because this is the first time they're seeing this machine. So we've been talking to Voxen about creating some quick flashcards, something we can stick it on the ventilator so they know how to use it, how to put the patient on a mode, and how do you do SBT, and how do you set them on a high flow system. Very simple. So we're trying to make it simple for our staff, at frontline staff, so they can use it and they will use it. What else? Like in some of the other challenges we were seeing is like switching modes. Our staff had some challenges about that, and nursing challenges where like how do they do 100% if they have to suction, and some of those are challenges we've been sharing with Voxen. It looks like they've been working on it, and they've been very supportive. And we'll be, most of the time we do Zoom calls with our with Voxen, the clinical team, and they've been very supportive with our team on that. So in a quick run, I think it's been working really well for us at Emory Midtown, and we've been using it in our CVICU too, for post-op CABGs and cardiac patients, and also we can do cough therapy on those patients. So we are holding all the ICU ventilator for really critical patients who are prone, but the more stable patients, we are using more Voxens. This is just my experience from using it at Midtown. Yeah.
I think one of the things Vinod said that, like Rob said about the oxygen stuff that's at the AARC website, Dean Hess did a webinar on how to use your non-invasive ventilator to do invasive ventilation, which is on the AARC website. It's free to everybody. So I don't have the link right in front of me, but if you're interested and you go to the site, there's the AARC.org website has got COVID-19 resources, and there are a number of lectures there that usually short, less than 15 minutes. Mine about the ventilators, Rob about the oxygen stuff, and Dean about how to use a non-invasive ventilator to do invasive ventilation. And I think those things are very helpful for people.
Well, thank you all for this tremendous session and expertise. I'd like to ask Denny and Christian. Denny's in Southern California, is head of the ICU at Scripps Chula Vista, and Christian is at UC Davis and in the ICU there. And if you have any questions, guys, and thoughts, as you are also experts in surge preparedness.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm at a small community hospital, and Catholic Charity Hospital, actually. If you can be underserved in San Diego County, it's an underserved area that is 6 miles from the border with Mexico. Our little hospital has 103 COVID out of 122 beds, so it's we've kind of stayed that way throughout this most recent. So we have some experience. I think the hardest thing about the Voxen is figuring out how to turn it on. But we've been in serviced on it, and it seems to be a fairly good thing. I can't say we've used it a ton. So, but other questions I really enjoyed the oxygen conserving thing. I think that's what I see as when I make rounds on the ward, is I think we can do a better job using some of the tools that we have, like and lower our, I think we could get by on lower high flow levels than we're probably using up on our wards. And I think that's an educational process, and I laud you. I think I'm taking home that I'm going to put more masks on and on these people too. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think my only thoughts to echo, what Denny had said. I'm also I did some ID training, so we focus a lot of our time on antimicrobial stewardship. And what I've not seen is really, for lack of a better term, gas stewardship or respiratory care stewardship. And as we go through this, it's not something we've had to worry about. But if you remember the early work that Denny and Asha did, there's multiple stages as we go through, eventually reach crisis standards of care. One of those is conservation. And I'm just curious, anybody listening, if you've had this where you've had a structured response to conserving both mechanical ventilation, any respiratory equipment, or medical gas. The only issue we ever came up with was very early on, where we didn't want to utilize nebulizers and we wanted to focus much more on meter dose inhalers. We did have a conservation process, probably back in March and April. That soon went by the wayside. We've brought this up here at UC Davis, and luckily we've not been as strapped as many of our colleagues down south have been with needing both medical gas or any other respiratory equipment. But I'm curious if anybody's worked in that same direction, the same way we do it with antibiotics, where we march through, different facilities and find the least invasive ventilator, least common denominator, least, gas consuming product.
I think that's what Vinod is describing that they've done at Emory. I think, I'm respiratory therapist in general. I mean, it's been a while since I've been a therapist in the ICU doing treatments, but for whatever reason, even in the surgery trauma ICU, every single patient on a ventilator is getting albuterol. And you probably are aware, or if you haven't thought about it, there's only one trial of albuterol in ARDS, and that was one of the ARDSNet trials, and it actually showed albuterol increased mortality. So one of the things that we should do in terms of respiratory therapy stewardship is not give aerosol therapy to people who don't have demonstrable evidence of airway disease. There's no other indication for it. And this is just a good time to do it. But I agree. I think we haven't had the oxygen problems either, but if you are having oxygen problems, it's good to take the respiratory therapist and look at every single patient. If they're on a ventilator, what's the bias flow? Can we reduce the bias flow? High flow nasal cannula and non-invasive ventilation in particular with a large leak uses far more oxygen than the ventilator connected to the patient with an endotracheal tube. And I think those are aspects that we need to look at. And I know we're getting a better understanding of high flow nasal cannula, and clearly not only does it's unidirectional flow in the nose and out the mouth, and that washes out the upper airway dead space. But the flow that it takes to wash out the upper airway dead space is oftentimes less than 6 liters a minute. Now, the other part of the high flow is the high flow going down to your airway when you take a breath in is a little bit like a boost. And then as you exhale against it, you get a little bit of end expiratory pressure, very little. But, studies with EIT shows that there's better distribution of gas. But clearly there's, 30 may be easily as good as 60 and 20 may be good as 60. But it's going to take time and titration to figure that out. And you can put a simple mask over the patient's face to act as a reservoir. In fact, some people have shown that when you put the surgical mask over the patient's face, it actually improves the oxygenation a little bit because it probably acts to trap oxygen underneath the mask. But I don't know if anybody else wants to answer. Rob, have you guys done anything about purposely trying to reduce the amount of oxygen use? I think about this from one of my earlier times. I don't know if there's any anesthesia people on, but all anesthesia machines, workstations in the hospital are constantly running oxygen through them, even through the middle of the night, to help dry the CO2 absorbers and eliminate any production of carbon monoxide. So again, there are a lot of tiny places. It's a case where I think pennies make dollars.
That's a great point, Rich. I think we're kind of ending on, we don't have as much time as we thought we would have. I wanted to open it up for the group that has participated here, all the attendees, to share with us if there's any stress points that they're experiencing, if they'd like to pick your brains about that. Or maybe we're all just in this learning mode. and wondering what we're going to do next as we're facing this surge of patients. I know that many people have heard of the term crisis care, and we're hoping not to enter into that phase where you have to decide who gets a certain resource. So I think all of this conversation has been useful for that, as people, now we have to conserve oxygen. We've always needed that as a plan. Christian, Denny, any other thoughts for the group?
Well, I think this is a great venue with a lot of smart people on this from around California and beyond. And if we're going to continue this, I think we're going to have to tackle that potential crisis care as we go forward. I just think we're going to have to talk about ways of doing that. I really enjoyed the oxygen conservation. We're going to have to do it with a whole bunch of other things too. And I think this is a great venue to kind of talk about that and find out from people around what they're missing or need, or finding innovative ways to get around it. And maybe if we share those things and work collaboratively, we'll get through this. But I think we need to communicate, and not work in silos. And I'm just afraid that if we don't do that, we're going to regionally and generally come out underneath this thing. And I'd like to be on top, to be honest with you.
I would agree with Denny. I think, regionalization of how we manage our patients and resources is key. And what we've seen is, the hospital down the street could be in what they think is crisis, care, and we may not be up the street. And working together and at least sharing that information so we can help someone get out of a more difficult space, or confirm that they are in that difficult space and help offload patients, I think is going to be key as we move forward. And, I'd like to rely on the fact that the governor's office may support us through that, but they may not. And I think, at least from an intellectual and academic side, this is a great forum for those ideas.
Well, thank you. There was one question from a physician who had asked about different ways folks de-escalate isolation procedures, time versus testing. And I don't know if there is any standard in that regard. I don't know what you guys are doing for that in terms of, I'm assuming the question's about if you're COVID positive. And I think it's basically the time. But is anybody doing a testing strategy?
Yeah, I can talk to that. We just had a meeting actually earlier today, and in terms of the 5 hospital script system, we have opted not to use testing as that, and to go with time-based de-escalation as the primary. And I think that it's smart. We've had some experience now with that, and so far, it's been working for us to do time-based only in the ICU, in the intensive care.
Yeah, we started with a predominantly time-based approach, which ID sort of championed, for lack of a better term. But obviously, much of our staff was pretty concerned about the time-based, particularly patients who are on mechanical ventilation and the fibroproliferative portion of their ARDS. They may or may not be trached, particularly our ECMO patients. That in some of those cases where we get a lot of blowback, we're actually doing 2 negative tests. So, we'll test somebody. If they're positive, we wait a week. If they're negative, we repeat it the next day. If they're then negative, we discontinue isolation. And we've sort of left it up, to the masses, so to speak. So some units may engage in that, some may not. Not the best option, but the path of least resistance at times.
Well, thank you all for your time tonight. I hope we will plan to continue this. Dr. Nick Hill is going to be speaking next week to us on high flow nasal cannula in greater detail. And we'll definitely, as Denny has mentioned, would like, I think we need to group think on crisis care. And I think maybe we'll just split our time on those two topics for next week. And Christian, Denny, we'll count on you for that. Rich, Vinod, Rob, thank you very, very much for your time this evening and helping us in California. And we, you've got lots of thank yous in the chat box. So I wish everyone a good night. And also this forum should be an open session and vent session if we need, if things are going wrong in our institutions. Let's share. We're here to support each other. So with that, I wish you all a good night and a good weekend. Get some rest, everyone.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.